Welcome to another installment of a KO European History SIGcast. I'm Mr. Sig, and thank you once again for turning in, boys and girls. So we're still on the topic of absolutism in the 17th and 18th centuries, and in this episode we continue on the subject of Eastern absolute states. In the first installment, we reviewed some of the absolutist ways of Peter the Great. In this episode, we're going to look at other nations of the RAP acronym, RAP, and that of Austria and Prussia. Try to remember that in Eastern absolutism, as opposed to the Western absolutist way, the nobility clung to power more stubbornly. We saw this in our analysis of Poland, with the Liberum Veto and the kings versus the Shem. It's also kind of important to realize that there was not really a developed middle class developing in Eastern Europe like there was in France, where, as you remember, the middle class was appointed as nobility of the robe and were really important instruments of French absolutism in that their service through their loyalty and their dependency in helping the French crown under the intendant system, which really allowed the French monarchs to gain power over their local municipalities. So there was a middle class in the western part of Europe. However, that's because they underwent significant commercialization. We've had multiple lessons on commercialization that took place. This commercialization didn't really happen as much and was not as prevalent in the turbulent eastern part of Europe. In the east, they also had to deal with the threat of war from Eastern European and even Asian invaders. And those are really, really good motivations for Eastern European monarchs to say, hey, I got to consolidate and I got to take power so I can continue to protect my state. This consolidation of power, or centralization of power as we've been calling it, resulted in reduced political power of the nobility. However, nobles gained much greater power at the local level, in particular over their peasantry and serfs. So that agrarian-based economy with serfdom and peasantry that existed in Eastern Europe is kind of why we refer to the East as backwards. And again, a lot of people feel like it was like looking back into the Middle or Dark Ages. So let's look at and analyze serfdom in Eastern Europe. And after the 1300s, lords in Eastern Europe revived serfdom to combat increasing economic challenges. Areas most affected included Bohemia, Silesia, Hungary, Eastern Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. You see, there was a drop in population in the 14th century, especially, and we haven't talked about this in a while, but the Black Death. And it created tremendous labor shortages and really, really hard times for the landowning nobility. The lords demanded that their kings and princes issue laws restricting or eliminating peasants' rights to move freely. This kind of creates a new feeling of serfdom. By 1500, Prussian territories had laws requiring runaway peasants to be hunted down and returned to their lords. Laws were passed that froze peasants in their social class. They couldn't move up or down. Lords confiscated peasants' lands and imposed heavier labor obligations on them. And the legal system was monopolized by the local lord. And we'll see Frederick the Great kind of take control back of that and give it more of an enlightened approach to justice. But, non-serf peasants were also affected. And there was something called the robot. And in certain regions, peasants were required to work 3 to 4 days without pay per week for their local lord if their local lord needed it. Serfdom will continue to be consolidated into the 1600s. If you remember, we talked about the price revolution that occurred as commercialization and colonization was taking place with the countries of Western Europe. So this price revolution, actually, food prices will start to increase because of that influx of gold and silver from the Americas. And, some of these landowning nobles will actually benefit from the agrarian system of serfdom that we just talked about. So, again, there were surpluses in wheat and timber. They were sold to big foreign merchants who exported them to feed the wealthier West. So the West is benefiting from the agricultural revolution, but also some of the agricultural production of the East. And the landowning nobility are benefiting from that, making lots and lots of money, yet they're making it on the backs of serfs. So why serfdom in Eastern Europe and not Western Europe? Well, the reasons were not necessarily all economic. The West was also devastated, if you remember, by the Black Death and resulted in labor shortage. but those labor shortages actually helped labor. Political reasons are more plausible, and the supremacy of the noble landlords. Most kings, in fact, were essentially first among equals in the noble class and directly benefited from serfdom in the East. Eastern lords had more political power than in the West, and monarchs needed the nobility. Constant warfare, as we said, in Eastern Europe and political chaos resulted in the noble landlord class increasing their political power at the expense of the monarch. In some cases early on, weak Eastern kings really could not combat the Asian invaders, and so it's, again, breakdown of the system, centralization. It's more like what we saw in feudalism. So again, they had little power to control their landlord policies, and especially the landlord policies aimed at peasants. Strong sovereign kings in the East were really not in place prior to 1650, whereas we saw in the West, there was a tradition going back to really the 1300s, and you could argue even back to the end of the 100 Years' War in the 1200s, most notably with the development of the Tudors in England, obviously the Habsburgs taking kind of control over Spain, the 100 Years' War with the House of Valois, that eventually would lead to the House of Bourbon. But also what we need to know is peasants were politically weaker in the East than in the West. In fact, the uprisings in the East, the few that happened, did not succeed. If you remember, in the summer assignment, we learned about peasants' revolts in the West that were actually semi-successful, like the Jacquerie and the English Peasants' Revolt, which it wasn't totally a success, but they forced the governments to make modifications and adaptations that benefited some of the peasants. Peasant solidarity in the East was weaker also than Western communities, and also undermined medieval privileges of towns, and power of urban classes were prevalent in the eastern part of Europe. Populations of towns and the importance of urban middle class declined significantly in the East, whereas we're going to see in the West, more urbanization took place. Population in town were increasing, and so there were relatively some more opportunities there than there were in the East. Okay, we've been talking about Prussia for some time, introducing, and I've indicated that will become eventually modern Germany. So what is Prussia? We have to understand that Prussia was run by the Hohenzollern faction, the Hohenzollern dynasty. Brief background of Brandenburg, Prussia, is the ruler of Brandenburg was designated as one of the 7 electors in the Holy Roman Empire in 1417. Yet by the 17th century, Brandenburg was not really significantly involved in Holy Roman Emperor affairs. Marriages increasingly gave this family of the Hohenzollerns control of the German principalities in central and western Germany. The prince had little power of the nobility, but the first Hohenzollern to put Prussia on the map was that of Frederick William the Great Elector. He was a strict Calvinist, but started the trend of the Hohenzollerns to grant religious tolerance to Catholics and Jews. He really admired the Swedish system of government and the economic power of the Netherlands. So the ongoing struggle between Sweden and Poland for the control of the Baltic after 1648 and the 30 Years' War, and also the wars of Louis XIV, created an atmosphere of permanent crisis. Prussia was invaded in 1656 by the Tatars of southern Russia, who killed or carried off as slaves more than 50,000 people. So no love lost between the German people and the Russians. The invasion weakened the nobles' estates and strengthened the urgency of the electors' demands for more money and a larger army. Thus, the Prussian nobility really refused to join representatives of towns in resisting royal power. So what you started to have was the nobility actually working side by side with Frederick William the Great Elector. And he establishes Prussia as a great power and laid the foundation for the future unification of Germany that will take place in the 19th century. His most significant contribution, overseeing the Prussian development of militarism and creating the most efficient army in Europe. He employed military power and taxation to unify all of his Rhine holdings, Prussia and Brandenburg, into a strong state that became known as Prussia. Increased military spending was achieved through heavy taxes, twice that of Louis XIV in France. The Prussian nobility was also not exempted like they were in France. They let him go because they needed protection from the invaders, and he let them keep their power and influence locally over the peasants and serfs. Also crucial to understanding the development of what we know as Prussia developing into a modern state, and that of Germany later, one must know about the Junkers. Pittsburghese will tell you it's the Junkers, but they formed the backbone of the Prussian military officer corps. These were nobles and landowners, and they dominated the estates of Brandenburg in Prussia. So in 1653, Frederick William the Great Elector gave hereditary subjugation of serfs to them as a policy to compensate them for their support of the crown and paying their taxes. He also gave them some power where Louis was taking away power in the nobility of France. So kind of an opposite, tactic than what was going on in the West. The Hohenzollerns are also, in a way, dependent on the Junkers to allow them to take that power and authority. So this will serve, they will be allowed to serve in the highest positions in the German bureaucracy and the Prussian military. There was a Frederick I, and then there's also a Frederick William I, who ruled right before Frederick the Great. But he was known as the Soldier King, and he was the most important Hohenzollern regarding the development of Prussian absolutism, so I felt it necessary to kind of give you a little bit of background here. He was Calvinist like his father, and he obsessed with finding tall soldiers for his army when they had to be around 6 feet tall to even be in the Prussian military. For him, he thought it meant intimidating his opponents. He infused militarism into all Prussian society. Prussia under Frederick William I became known as the Sparta of the North. One notable diplomat said, "Prussia is not a state with an army, but it's an army with a state." Kind of puts perspective on things, how important the Prussian military was to their state. Society became rigid and highly disciplined. Unquestioning obedience was the highest virtue. It was the most militaristic society of modern times, and he nearly doubled the size of the army. Also important is that it became the best army in Europe. It was their fourth largest army, next to France, Russia, and Austria. 80% of the government's revenues and money that it took in went towards the military. Prussian army was designed to avoid war through deterrence, but if they needed to fight, it was known to have a nasty reputation of being highly disciplined and highly effective. Only time Frederick William fought a war was with Sweden when they occupied a city in northern Germany, and the Swedes were subsequently forced out. He also developed the most efficient bureaucracy in Europe. He removed the last of the parliamentary estates and local self-governments. He got rid of them. He demanded absolute obedience and discipline from all civil servants. And he gave promotion based on merit, kind of like Peter the Great in the table of ranks. Some commoners were also able to rise to some positions within the bureaucracy. But as we said, there was high levels of taxation to support this bureaucracy and to support this military. Obviously, the Junkers remained officers in the caste system of the army in return for supporting the king's absolutism. And he also, one thing that, this kind of establishes what eventually will become Germany's trademark with education and engineering. He established compulsory education in 1717 and established approximately 1,000 schools for even peasant children. So in the next episode, we'll go into the next most important of the Hohenzollerns, especially for the AP exam. We'll go into that of Frederick the Great. Thanks for tuning in.